What's up, everybody? My name is Tim Ruswick, and today we're talking about how I plan my games, my kind of process to make games, and kind of how I go about the whole game making process. So, I want to be very clear that process is one of those things that really changes depending on project and mood and scope and team and a bunch of different stuff. And like with my bigger project, the Philophobia, like the process is kind of changed and kind of folded back on itself a couple times just because it's a longer project. But generally, I have a process that I kind of stick to. This is stuff that I stick to for game jams. It's stuff that I stick to for all the Finish Friday stuff we did. Probably, I would say we did maybe 8 to 12 games live on stream following this process out of the 18 or so games I've made so far. So it's pretty simple. I'm just kind of walk through the steps of like what I do. And if you've ever watched a stream that we've done from start to finish, you've probably noticed this process in action. So first thing that we start with in the process is the mechanic. I make sure that I understand the mechanic. I make sure that I have something that I like. The mechanic doesn't have to be perfect at this point. It doesn't have to be great. I don't have to have all the details figured out, but I have to have something interesting, something that maybe I haven't seen before, or maybe I have a new twist on something. I just like something interesting, like if you just got a dude that runs and jumps on a platform with a side scroller, like that's 10,000 games out there. Like that's not an interesting mechanic. So it's something beyond the traditional mechanics. So once I have the mechanic and I think about it, then I build the prototype and I make sure that I build something that matches what I thought about. And if I can't get it to match quite, maybe I'll keep tweaking it. I'll keep messing with it, and I'll make sure that what I have is interesting. And a lot of times from the mechanic, the concept of the mechanic to the prototype, things change. Like your brain is a horrible emulator, as Chris DeLeon would say, and it's not always accurate when you put it from your brain into the computer. So there's some tweaking in that process, and there's a little more tweaking on the third step, which is where I tweak until it's fun. So I find something interesting, I put it in the computer and build a prototype, and I tweak it until I think it's fun. And sometimes that involves building a tiny bit of content, building, a lot of placeholder art. Sometimes just building the basics, building blocks of like what the game is. And this varies per game, obviously, because there's so many different things that you could build for so many different types of games. But that's kind of the process. And then once I have the mechanic built in like a prototype, and I think that it's fun, I find it fun, and this is usually the phase that we started at on Finish Friday because I usually had the prototype and it was already usually fun. But then I will pick a theme. Usually, we'll say, okay, maybe this weird square that magnetically shifts to this position when I tap that, maybe that's a magnet and you're magnet boy and you want to attach to metal because you love metal or something like that. In the example of like our recent game jam game, the idea was reverse tower defense. Then I built the prototype of this little thing, and then I was like, okay, well, what if this is a garden and you're gnomes and gnomes invade? Actually, I don't think I came up with that, but the stream did. But like that was kind of the process. Is like we had the working prototype. It was interesting. It was fun, and then we added the gnomes and the old man and all that stuff on top of it. So it didn't come like that wasn't the idea. Let's build a gnome game with an angry old man. No, it was like let's build a reverse tower defense game. We did that, and then with a prototype, then we added the gnomes on top of it. So after we pick a theme, then I work on the art because we've got a basic prototype. We've got the everything's working, and we understand what kind of thing we're going for, what kind of visual style. We understand all that. So I work on the art. Some people don't like to work on the art here. I do because what I've realized is that the art for me tends to change how the game plays. There are some collision issues. There are like, sometimes you have to rescale stuff and move it around. Sometimes you want to change environments completely. Sometimes you want to build environments specifically around certain pieces of art. And so getting like a first run of art in is a good idea at this point for me. Like for bigger games, especially like bigger 3D games, like you can't get all the art in, right? Like that's just going to be an impossible task right there. But you want to get enough art in to where you can kind of be working in vertical slice territory, to where you can kind of see like what the game is going to look like and feel like, because a lot of the tweaks that you make are going to be dependent on the art and the animation and stuff like that. And so even though there may be a lot more to add later, I like to have the basics of the art there so I can test and tweak stuff, and I can kind of build the vertical slice final-ish version of the game at that point. So once I create the art and I implement everything, then I do the sound. And the sound, I feel like, is just as important, if not more important, than the art, especially in a game jam. Like I said, one of my rules for game jam is if you got to choose between art and sound, pick sound, because sound makes such a big impact in the game. And I like to put sound in to really understand how things feel. And again, sound for me tends to tweak how everything moves and works. So like every once in a while, like for the Gnome game, for example, there was the cannon that we were using, and it was shooting these little seeds. And I came up with this really cool sound effect, and I was like, well, what that sound effect feels like, it should be like slower, like boom, 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 not boom, 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 like it was going before. So we actually slowed down the cannon because it felt better with the sound effect and everything else. And we did this something similar with the tomato plant, because the plant would throw these tomatoes, but the sound effect that I made wasn't 100% consistent with the animation. So we actually tweaked the animation. We made the animation faster, and that kind of made everything fit together. I don't know if there's a normal process for other game developers. I would imagine that if you've got like a sound guy or something, you could probably have your sound effects tweaked to the animation, but I kind of mix everything together, and it's a very collaborative process for me. I like to mix all the different skill sets because I like doing all the stuff. So it's like a giant mixture of sound and art for me. And that's why one of the reasons why I like to go through this phase, even if I'm not doing all the content, like I'm not doing all the art, I'm not doing all the sound, I like to mix it in so that I can kind of build this whole complete-ish thing. And then we have that done. And that's good. And the sound for me includes music as well. And music you probably want to pick or create before the sound effects. And this is a rule that I ignore every once in a while. But for the most part, music is really important, and music will really affect the way that your sound sounds, and it'll affect the mixing and all that stuff. So definitely keep that in mind. After we do the sound, I tweak a little bit more, and I implement everything. So I make sure everything is implemented, and then I do all those little tweaks that I was talking about. Make sure everything is perfect. And then once we've got it all where we want it, like everything works and you can go through it, that's when I do all the menu screens and stuff. So my goal with this is to create a vertical slice. And if you're in a game jam, this is super important because you want something, you want to have a menu, you want to have like a win state and so on and so forth. But even in a project, if this is on a longer scale, like than a weekend, so like a week or a month, you still want to have a playable thing. Like even if the menu doesn't look great, if it just works, it's still a playable thing. So they can go to the menu, they can hit start, the game will start, they can do something, they can win, and they'll go to the win screen. And so, like I said, even though you don't have all the content, you may not have all the levels, you may not have all that stuff, but you have a whole process. And so that's why I like to do the menu at this point, because now we've got maybe like one level, we've got the menu, then we've got the win screen and all that stuff, so you can kind of go through the whole thing. After I do that, and it's I think it's the last piece, and probably the most time-consuming piece. Well, it depends on what type of game you're making, but for content-heavy games, this is definitely going to be the biggest piece, and that's the actual content itself. So if you're making a platformer, for example, this might be the level design. This might be a bunch of just additional stuff, or if you need upgrades for your character, or you need the ability to kind of progress as a thing, like all of that is content. And I think content comes last in this whole process, because you're going to tweak so many things during all these little steps, like the art, the sound, the prototype, making it work, making it act right, adding the different things. Like for us, we added a bunch of different towers. We change the speed, we change the shooting speed, we change whether or not the bullets will impact with stuff, we change what bounced off of what. So we tweaked 1,000 things, right? And if we were building levels before we did all that, we'd have to rebuild a lot of those levels. And this goes doubly true for like platformers, because you know there are jump gaps, there are gaps between spaces that you can't make, there are arches and stuff designed specifically for the player jump height. And if you tweak jump height in something like a platformer after you build a bunch of content, you're gonna have to go back through all that content. So content comes last. And this for the game jam, I think, is something we actually were really light on for No Man's Land, because that was the very last thing we got to. I literally was building level 2 as the timer was expiring. So content comes last, but as a result, the entire game feels solid. The game feels done. The game feels ready to ship. It feels polished. It feels great. It sounds great, thanks to Gary, mostly. And it's just it's a fantastic little experience. I feel like if we were missing any one of those things along the way, it wouldn't feel as good. And I feel like even though the content is light, the game is good. And content is one of those things you can always add. And people ask me a lot about early access, even though I've never done early access. The one thing I do know about early access is I would not ship without an end state. And early access games that you want to ship, if I was going to do it, I would definitely do a content heavy game, and I would ship a mostly complete game light on content as an early access title, and then I would continually add content, because I feel like at that point the game is mostly done, and you can give it to somebody and they can play it all the way through and there's an ending, but you can keep adding more stuff. Whereas a lot of people do that reverse. They'll say, well, here's all the content, but then we keep tweaking the mechanics or whatever, and I feel like that is just asking for trouble. That's a bunch of work, and it's going to upset players because they like the old movement or they liked whatever, and it could just get crazy. So that's my process. This is the process, like I said, that I've used for the Finish Friday games. I use for game jams. I've used it for Phallophobia mostly. The content stage is what we're in now. Like, the game is mostly done. However, we have went back. I keep saying we, but like really me. It's just me. I keep going back and adding little things. I go back to the mechanic phase sometimes, and then the mechanic, if I add an extra mechanic, I need the art for it, I need the sound for it, and so this whole process is really kind of a loop sometimes for bigger projects, because depending on which sections or which chunks you're building, you can end up looping back through this a couple times. But for me, for game jams, especially for smaller projects, this is like a one-shot thing, and it's worked for me really well, and I'm really happy with the process. And like I said, I'm on my 18th game. I think No Man's Land was 18. So I've kind of had a little bit of time to perfect this process and kind of figure out what the best order and process and all that is. And I feel like this is mine. With that being said, I would love to hear yours. Do you have a process? Do you do stuff in a certain order? Leave that in the comments down below, because I'd be interested what other people have to say. I know I'm not the only one that kind of got into a groove of things and kind of does things their own way. So I would love to learn from you guys as well. Leave those in the comments down below, and I will see you again tomorrow.